Matthew stared at the ocean waves crashing against the shore, the salty breeze doing little to calm the tempest brewing in his chest. He and Sophie had just returned from their annual beach vacation, a tradition that had become the highlight of their marriage. 6 years of laughter, shared adventures, and what he believed was unwavering loyalty, all now cast into shadow by a single confession. Sophie's words rang in his ears, repeating like a broken record. "I had an affair with a hotel animator." He remembered the moment vividly. They had been packing their suitcases, preparing for the return flight. Sophie had sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she delivered the gut-punching truth. The admission had come out of nowhere, like a sharp knife cutting through the thin veneer of the life they had built together. At first, he had been furious, rage consuming him as he demanded to know every detail. But then, just as suddenly, something unexpected happened. Sophie broke down, her tears soaking the sheets as she begged for his forgiveness. She promised it was a mistake, that she had been swept up in the novelty of it all, and that it had meant nothing. "I love you, Matthew. I don't know why I did it," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. Please don't leave me." In that moment, Matthew felt something shift inside him. Against all logic, against every instinct screaming at him to walk away, he forgave her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he loved her deeply, or maybe it was because the thought of life without her felt like a punishment he couldn't endure. For the next 2 weeks, Matthew tried to move past the betrayal. He buried the pain, compartmentalizing it like a bad memory shoved into the attic of his mind. But then Sophie hit him with the second bombshell. "I'm pregnant." He froze. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating him. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice cracking. Sophie nodded, her eyes wide and uncertain. "I found out a few days ago. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was scared." Matthew's thoughts raced. Was the child his? Or had Sophie conceived during her fling with the hotel animator? His stomach churned at the thought. He felt like a man dangling over the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to climb back up or let go entirely. "I need time to think," he muttered, standing abruptly and walking out the door. Sophie called after him, but he didn't stop. He needed air, space to process the whirlwind his life had become. Matthew found himself wandering aimlessly through the park near their apartment. Children played on the swings, their laughter cutting through the chilly autumn air. He sat on a bench, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of his emotions. He loved Sophie, that much was certain. But love wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. And now, with the possibility that the child wasn't his, he didn't know how to move forward. Later that evening, Sophie approached him cautiously. She had spent the entire day pacing the apartment, racked with guilt and worry. "Matthew," she began softly, "I understand if you're angry. I understand if you hate me. But please, don't give up on us." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "I need to know something, Sophie. Is there a chance the baby isn't mine?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she admitted. "There's a chance. I wish I could say for sure that it's yours, but I can't." Matthew felt his heart break all over again. He had hoped for reassurance, for a reason to believe that they could salvage what was left of their marriage. Instead, he was left with more uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do this," he said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. Sophie took a shaky breath. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm sorry. I'll take a paternity test as soon as it's possible. I'll go to counseling. Anything, Matthew. Just don't leave me." Her desperation was palpable, and it tugged at his heartstrings. Despite everything, he still cared for her. But was love enough to weather this storm? The following weeks were a blur of tension and avoidance. Matthew threw himself into work, using long hours at the office as an excuse to stay away from home. Sophie, meanwhile, tried to make amends in every way she could. She cooked his favorite meals, left him little notes apologizing for her actions, and even suggested couples therapy. But Matthew remained distant. Every time he looked at Sophie, he was reminded of her betrayal. And every time he thought about the baby growing inside her, he was filled with dread. One evening, Matthew confided in his best friend, James, over a few beers at their favorite bar. "Am I a fool for staying?" Matthew asked, staring into his drink. James sighed. "It's not that simple, man. Forgiveness isn't a weakness. It takes strength. But you need to ask yourself if this is something you can live with. If the baby isn't yours, can you still be a father to it? Can you still be with Sophie?" Matthew didn't have an answer. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie's pregnancy began to show. The sight of her growing belly was a constant reminder of the uncertainty hanging over them. Despite his doubts, Matthew found himself softening. He couldn't ignore the bond they had shared for 6 years, or the way Sophie looked at him with a mix of hope and regret. The day of the paternity test finally arrived. Sophie was in her second trimester, and the doctor had assured them that the procedure would be safe for both her and the baby. Matthew sat in the waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously as he filled out the necessary paperwork. Sophie reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The gesture didn't go unnoticed, and she bit her lip to keep from crying. The test itself was quick and painless. As they left the clinic, Sophie turned to Matthew. "No matter what the results say, I want you to know that I love you," she said earnestly. Matthew nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't ready to make any promises. The following days were agonizing. Matthew avoided Sophie even more than usual, spending his nights on the couch instead of their bed. The distance between them grew wider with each passing moment. When the results finally arrived, Matthew's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Sophie stood nearby, her face pale and anxious. "It's yours," Matthew said, his voice barely above a whisper. Relief washed over Sophie, and she let out a sob. "Matthew, He held up a hand to stop her. "This doesn't fix everything, Sophie. It's going to take time for me to trust you again." "I'll do whatever it takes," she promised. In the months leading up to the baby's birth, Matthew and Sophie worked tirelessly to rebuild their relationship. They attended therapy sessions together, where Sophie confronted the reasons behind her infidelity and Matthew expressed the pain it had caused him. The sessions weren't easy, and there were times when Matthew wanted to give up. But he reminded himself of the love they had shared and the family they were about to start. When their daughter, Lily, was born, Matthew felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. Holding her tiny hand in his own, he realized that she was innocent in all of this. She didn't ask to be born into a fractured family, and he owed it to her to try to make things work. But as the weeks went on, Matthew couldn't shake the lingering resentment. He began to notice things he hadn't before. Small lies Sophie told, little details that didn't add up. The trust they were trying to rebuild felt like it was made of sand, crumbling with every wave of doubt. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, Matthew sat Sophie down at the kitchen table. "I've been trying, Sophie. I really have. But I don't think I can do this anymore." Her face crumpled. "Matthew, please." He shook his head. "I love Lily, and I'll always be there for her. But I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. The betrayal, it's always going to be there." Sophie broke down, but Matthew remained firm. He knew that staying together for the sake of the child would only lead to more pain in the long run. In the end, they decided to co-parent amicably, putting Lily's needs above their own. It wasn't the future Matthew had envisioned, but it was a new beginning, one where he could finally start to heal. As he packed his bags and prepared to leave the home they had shared, Matthew felt a strange sense of relief. He had fought for their marriage, but he realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The first few weeks after leaving the house were agonizing for Matthew. He rented a modest apartment on the other side of town, sparsely furnished and eerily quiet. Each night, he'd stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep, haunted by memories of the life he and Sophie had built together. Yet, when he held Lily during his scheduled visits, the ache in his chest softened. Her tiny fingers wrapping around his brought him moments of peace, a reminder of the innocence and love that still existed in his life. Sophie, on the other hand, was struggling to adjust to life as a single mother. Their once shared home now felt cold and unfamiliar without Matthew's presence. She reached out often, sending pictures of Lily and updates about her milestones. Matthew responded politely but kept his replies short, maintaining an emotional distance. Sophie suggested joint outings, for Lily's sake, but Matthew declined. It wasn't that he didn't want to see his daughter. He simply wasn't ready to be around Sophie without reopening old wounds. One evening, Matthew received a call from Sophie. Lily said her first word today, Sophie said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. Matthew smiled, though she couldn't see it. What did she say? She said, Dada. Sophie replied, her voice cracking. She was looking at your picture when she said it. The news hit Matthew like a freight train. He wanted to be there for every moment of Lily's life, but the weight of his fractured relationship with Sophie made it impossible. Thanks for letting me know, he said softly before hanging up. As he set his phone down, Matthew realized that co-parenting with Sophie would be harder than he had imagined. No matter how much distance he tried to put between them, their shared love for Lily would always bind them together. Matthew threw himself into work, using long hours at the office to distract himself from the emptiness he felt. On weekends, he devoted all his attention to Lily, taking her to the park, reading her bedtime stories, and cherishing the time they had together. One Saturday, while shopping for groceries, Matthew ran into an old college friend, Rebecca. She was standing in the produce aisle, scrutinizing a bag of oranges when she noticed him. Matthew, is that you? She asked, her eyes lighting up with recognition. Rebecca. Wow, it's been ages, Matthew replied, surprised but genuinely happy to see her. They spent the next 15 minutes catching up, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Rebecca mentioned that she had recently moved back to town after a bad breakup and was working as a freelance graphic designer. When Matthew mentioned Lily, Rebecca's face softened. You're a dad now? That's amazing. She's lucky to have you. Something about Rebecca's genuine warmth and kindness struck a chord with Matthew. Before parting ways, she handed him her business card. If you ever want to grab a coffee and chat, let me know, she said with a smile. Matthew hesitated for a moment before slipping the card into his pocket. Weeks passed, and Matthew couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca. There was something refreshing about her presence, her easy laughter, her grounded perspective on life. One afternoon, on a whim, he texted her, Hey Rebecca, want to grab that coffee you mentioned? She responded almost immediately, I'd love to. When and where? They met at a cozy cafe downtown, and their conversation flowed as naturally as it had in the grocery store. For the first time in months, Matthew felt like himself again. Like the man he had been before Sophie's betrayal had shaken his confidence. Rebecca asked about Lily, and Matthew found himself opening up about fatherhood, his struggles with co-parenting, and even the pain of his failed marriage. I'm sorry you went through all that, Rebecca said sincerely, but it sounds like you're doing an amazing job for your daughter. That takes strength. Matthew felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Their coffee dates became a weekly occurrence, and soon, Matthew found himself looking forward to them. Rebecca's kindness and understanding began to chip away at the walls he had built around his heart. But every time he felt himself growing closer to her, a voice in the back of his mind whispered, What if you're making a mistake? What if you get hurt again? Meanwhile, Sophie was grappling with her own feelings of regret. She had thought that losing Matthew would be temporary, that his anger would eventually fade, and they could rebuild their life together. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that Matthew wasn't coming back. The distance between them felt insurmountable, and Sophie couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on her every day. She started going to therapy, hoping to make sense of her actions and find a way to move forward. During one session, her therapist asked a question that caught her off guard. Do you think you've truly taken responsibility for what happened? Sophie frowned. I've apologized to Matthew. I've tried to show him that I'm sorry. But have you forgiven yourself? The therapist pressed. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She realized she hadn't. Deep down, she still saw herself as the woman who had destroyed her marriage. The woman who had made a selfish, impulsive decision that hurt the person she loved most. The therapist encouraged her to write a letter to Matthew, not to send, but to express everything she was feeling. Sophie spent hours pouring her heart onto the page, apologizing not just for the affair but for the pain she had caused him and the family they had built together. When she finished, she felt a small sense of relief, though she knew it would take time to truly heal. One evening, Matthew and Rebecca sat on a park bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. "I've been thinking about introducing you to Lily," Matthew said hesitantly. "But I don't want to rush things." Rebecca smiled. "Whenever you're ready. I'd love to meet her." Matthew nodded, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. Rebecca wasn't trying to replace Sophie or fix him. She was simply there, offering her support and companionship. A few weeks later, Matthew invited Rebecca over for dinner. Lily took to her immediately, giggling as Rebecca helped her build a tower out of wooden blocks. Watching them together, Matthew felt a warmth spread through his chest. Later that night, after Rebecca had left, Sophie called. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For what?" Matthew asked, surprised. "For being a great father to Lily, and for giving me the chance to work on myself. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm glad you've found some happiness again." Matthew was silent for a moment before replying. "I'll always care about you, Sophie, but we're better this way. For Lily and for ourselves." As he hung up, Matthew felt a sense of closure. The wounds of the past hadn't fully healed, but they were no longer raw. He was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold, with an open heart. And as he watched Lily sleep that night, her tiny hand clutching her favorite stuffed animal, he realized that love wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, growth, and the courage to start over.